I have something I need to confess. For a long time I've called myself a fan of Spyro, but the truth is I'm totally unfamiliar with most of the series. I feel like a fake fan. The only Spyro games I've played are the original trilogy and their remakes, and also this abomination. I do also own this, but I think the sight of this would cause all the real Spyro fans to jump into oncoming traffic, so I think we might just ignore that for now. I don't like being a fake fan because I mostly enjoy what the games I have played have to offer. Even Enter the Dragonfly has its moments. But I want to rectify this issue. I want to explore the corners of the Spyro series that are unknown to me, starting with Spyro Season of Ice. Going into this game, I was scared, because Spyro Season of Ice is a Spyro game on the Game Boy Advance, which means anything could happen with this. Quite often when a game series that's usually on home consoles gets a handheld game, that handheld game turns out to be shit by comparison, and I'm worried that that'll be the case here. But I haven't even turned the game on yet, so I can't start throwing around accusations like that. I'm bracing for the worst, but I'm keen to give Spyro Season of Ice a proper go and see what it's all about. The game opens with a little cutscene to introduce the minimal story this game has. Zoe the fairy sends a message to Spyro, Hunter and Bianca to ask for help because a Rhinoc named Grendor has frozen all the fairies in ice. Due to a magic spell gone wrong, Grendor ended up with 2 heads and a headache and wants to use the fairy's magic to reverse the effects of his spell. And of course, it's up to Spyro to rescue them. As a story, it's not the most exciting. In fact, I reckon the most interesting part is when Hunter somehow mistakes a balloon for a flying saucer. But it is slightly better than I was expecting. They created a new villain for this game rather than opting for reusing Nasty, Ripto or the Sorceress, and they also gave the fairies some relevance to what's going on. That's cool. In the Spyro games I've played, the fairies only ever serve as checkpoints, so I like that Season of Ice is giving them more of a spotlight. It may have the sort of narrative that can only be written by a lazy 6-year-old, but it's good enough, I think. But enough about that, let's play the game already. Spyro Season of Ice, much like every other Spyro game I've played, is a collectathon, where the goal is to explore levels in search of gems and other collectibles by running, jumping, gliding, charging and flaming where appropriate. The big difference here is the levels aren't 3D. Instead, we're dealing with an isometric viewpoint of 2D levels, which is fair enough. I wouldn't expect the developers of this game to try and build 3D levels for a Game Boy Advance game. That'd be like trying to install Minecraft onto a typewriter. It just isn't technically possible. Season of Ice seeks to replicate the feel of the original PS1 games with its gameplay, and I think it does a pretty good job. It follows a very similar structure. There are a number of hub worlds, each containing a handful of levels that all contain gems and fairies to collect. You need a certain number of fairies to progress to the next hub world, and occasionally you'll fight a boss. They're sticking to the Spyro formula like fleas to a dog, and I'm happy about that. It's a formula that works, so they have no reason to deviate. The same goes for Spyro himself. I used Autumn Fairy Home, the first hub world, to get a feel for how the game played, and I was impressed. They managed to replicate Spyro's abilities and movement from the PS1 game surprisingly well. Obviously it's not exactly the same since we're not in 3D here, but it feels very natural and comfortable. I have nothing to complain about. The meat of the game is what we really need to focus on here because it's where the game's biggest strengths and weaknesses lie. My first impressions of the main levels were very positive. I think they really captured the essence of Spyro. Picking up gems was very satisfying and fun, just as it was in the PS1 trilogy. The objectives to earn fairies were very basic and simple, but I personally think that's a good thing. When missions get overcomplicated with gimmicks and strange twists, it can sometimes suck the fun out of it, so I'm glad that this game sticks to what works. This, in combination with how well Spyro controls, impressed me. It's a pretty solid effort for a GBA interpretation of the PS1 games. But it didn't take long for me to notice some issues. While I did mostly enjoy exploring the levels in search of collectibles, a part of the process did rub me the wrong way. What I quickly realized was that it was very hard to get a sense for the level layout because everything looks the same. The levels repeat the same floor patterns frequently, and there are no landmarks to help you recognize areas you've already been to. I was constantly getting lost, and there wasn't really anything I could do about it. It's sort of like those old backgrounds in old school cartoons that keep repeating as the characters run along. The whole thing looks the same and keeps repeating. You can't even tell where you started most of the time. It doesn't help that some levels like Hummingbird Fort look disgusting. It's also hard to tell where you can even go. Because the game's viewpoint is centered so closely on Spyro, it can often be hard to tell where bits of the level actually are, since the way forward will be hidden off camera somewhere. You need to search around using the L button to see if there's any level off in the distance, which can get annoying. I would have preferred an option to zoom out rather than move the view around slightly, or maybe a map. I think that would have been more helpful in trying to navigate these levels. This game also has an issue with verticality and depth perception. One of the elements of Spyro games that sets them apart from other platformers is Spyro's ability to glide. It allows for more interesting, intricate level design and adds an extra layer to exploration. Season of Ice tries to implement this, but it wasn't a great success. Because it's so difficult to wrap your head around how the level is laid out, and because you can't always see where you can go, making those glides becomes less about intentionally exploring and more about blind leaps of faith, and that often results in death. On top of that, it can be difficult to gauge how high Spyro actually is. I'm not talking about drugs here, although he does smoke shrooms at one point in the game. I'm talking about literal height. The only indicator you have is his shadow, which only appears at a certain height above the ground. So very often you'll find yourself unable to tell how high Spyro actually is, and you'll end up overshooting or undershooting and plummeting into the abyss. To add to this, it can also be hard to tell how high the level itself is, because every inch of a given level looks the same, and because you can't even see where you're trying to go most of the time anyway, it isn't easy to work out if you can actually glide somewhere or not. Obviously it's easy to tell which platforms are at ground level, but every layer above that looks the same. Is the ground you're aiming to glide to above you or below you? Who knows? Certainly not you, the player. To make the issue ever so slightly worse, there are no checkpoints in any levels besides Sparx's, which I'll get to. The fairies in the prior games have always been used as checkpoints, but now that they're the main focus, they think they're top shit and don't have to lift a finger. Instead, when you die, you're kicked back to where you started the level. This would be fine, but it's a rough punishment when you're just trying to get through the level without plummeting to your doom because you're lost, alone, and confused. You have to try and retrace your steps without any landmarks or noticeable features to help you. That's brutal. It's a shame that the levels are built in a way that makes exploring and traversing them tedious, because otherwise, Season of Ice does a good job of sticking to what makes Spyro games fun. These issues don't ruin the game, but they do damage its enjoyability in the same way that sitting behind a tall person damages the enjoyability of a movie. The gameplay experience of the standard levels is solid apart from that. Specifying that there are standard levels implies that there are other types of levels in this game, and there are. 2 level types from the PS1 games also return in Season of Ice: Speedway levels and Sparx levels. Although to say Speedways return is a bit of a stretch because they're nothing like the traditional Speedways at all. In this game, they're a completely different thing. Rather than being required to fly through, destroy, or activate 4 groups of 8 things in an open area, Speedways in Season of Ice are more like Star Fox. You're on rails, constantly shooting whatever pops up on screen to earn time and gems, and reach the end of the course before time runs out. They've even got bosses at the end. It's very different, but it's cool, I like it. It would be incredibly difficult to replicate the Speedways from the PS1 games in a way that wouldn't end up being shit, so I'm glad they went for this approach instead. They're fun, intense, and they can be pretty difficult as well. Space Age Speedway's hard mode took me nearly an hour and a half to beat because of its time limit, which I felt was a bit too strict, but it was amazing feeling when I finally managed to get through it. The Speedways are definitely a fun change of pace and help keep things interesting. I wish I could say the same for Sparx's levels though. Sparx levels in Season of Ice are pretty much exactly the same as in Year of the Dragon, only they're slightly worse. They're structured the same way, you need to go around picking up gems and finding keys to unlock doors, but it's just a lot less fun to deal with than in Year of the Dragon. Rather than fucking around with the tedious amounts of enemies, I found it much easier to just charge through them and take damage until I got to the next checkpoint. Made the whole experience go a lot faster, which is good. The sooner I'm out of that ant farm, the better. What makes it worse is that you have to pay moneybags to even play these levels. They are not worth the effort it took to collect the gems to afford it, no way. Fuck off, moneybags. But before I move on, I have a question. Why are the fairies willing to help out Sparx by providing checkpoints but not Spyro? What's the deal with that? Spyro is the one who's actually going around saving the fairies. He needs the checkpoints more than Sparx does. Is he still not good enough for them? What does Sparx have that Spyro doesn't? Has Sparx been granting the fairies sexual favors? I mean, he's about the right size to shove up a fairy's I think I might censor that bit. Probably a bit much. Anyway, that's pretty much everything the game has to offer aside from 2 boss fights which are identical and suck balls. I mean, they did their best for a GBA boss fight, but it's still pretty bad. While the gameplay is decent, what I did notice at about the halfway point was that the game is very, very repetitive. Every standard level is pretty much the same. They're all structured in very similar ways, and they often recycle the same objectives. Each standard level has 6 fairies. You earn 1 for defeating all the enemies, 1 for flaming all the thematically relevant flammable objects, and a handful are scattered throughout the level that you need to seek out and find yourself. Each level will have its own unique objective to earn a fairy, but it usually just boils down to flaming or charging 4 or 5 identical set pieces like lighthouses or bird cages. Some levels will also have thieves and disappearing vases that reward you with fairies too, but that's it. On the whole, collecting fairies is almost exactly the same for each level. The only level that tried to do something different was Honey Marsh. No, not that Honey Marsh, I'm talking about this Honey Marsh, where one of the objectives involves luring angry bees out of their beehives and towards flowers. Beyond that, every level recycles the same objectives for fairies, and it gets pretty repetitive the longer you play the game. The Speedways and Sparks levels do help to combat the repetitiveness, but they also have the problem of being very similar to each other. There isn't much that separates the Speedways in terms of gameplay, and Sparks' levels don't even have different themes. By the time I reached the final hub world, I was bored of the game. I'd been completely drained of all enthusiasm because the game really is the same thing over and over again. That isn't inherently a bad thing, it works for certain games, but in a game like this, you need a bit more variety in the level structure and objectives to keep it interesting. Unfortunately, this game doesn't have that variety, so I was starting to find it boring. But seeing as I was towards the end, I thought I may as well see it through. It'll at least be nice to see what themes the remaining levels will have because the game does look and sound pretty good by GBA standards, aside from a few levels that look like unicorn vomit. And besides, it's not like the gameplay is bad, it's just repetitive. I can handle it for a bit longer. Relying on whatever scraps of willpower I could muster, I pushed forward and 100% completed the game. This unlocked a bonus minigame I could play called Dragonfly X. I gave it a go and it's essentially an endless run of Sparks levels, only he now has tank controls. I personally didn't think it was all that fun, but it's a neat little bonus for completing the whole game. At least it gives you something. I honestly wasn't expecting the game to reward me with anything at all. The game ends with Spyro defeating Grendor a second time and freeing Zoe the fairy from her icy tomb. It's at this moment that all the fairies say they would have helped Grendor fix his problems if he'd just asked them. Which just makes going around freeing them all feel like a complete waste of time, but whatever. After all sorts of colourful levels with identical objectives, speedways that got my blood pumping, and Sparks levels that were irritating and overpriced, I had seen everything there was to see in the game. What a ride. Spyro Season of Ice is one of those games where if you've played the first sort of 4 or 5 levels, you've pretty much seen the whole game. It's a decent game, but it has issues. Don't get me wrong, I did enjoy the game for a bunch of different reasons. Spyro controls extremely well. I'm very impressed with how closely they were able to replicate the feel of controlling Spyro in the original games here. In addition to that, Season of Ice also hits the same beats as the other Spyro games. It sticks to a great formula with the whole process of collecting gems and fairies being very satisfying and having some alternate gameplay styles that were decently fun to help sprinkle in some variety. Additionally, the game is presented nicely, the music is decent, and aside from a few ugly ducklings, the levels look great too. Season of Ice does a lot of things well, but there are some very obvious problems with it too. What I'm afraid of is accidentally making an unfair comparison. I don't want to fall into the trap of comparing Season of Ice to the PS1 trilogy and expecting Season of Ice to be just as good. That's a near impossible task. Season of Ice is at a clear disadvantage being on the Game Boy Advance. No matter how hard the developers tried, the game was never going to be capable of matching what the original trilogy was able to pull off, simply because of the hardware it's on. And I don't want to unfairly shit all over Season of Ice because of that, but I do think that being a GBA game is the source of some of the game's issues. While the levels look great as a whole, having the same patterns and visuals repeat across an entire level makes getting lost a very easy thing to do. And this isn't helped by the fact that the viewpoint is so closely fixated on Spyro that it's hard to tell what's around you and where you are in any given level. There are also problems with verticality and depth perception. Not only is it sometimes difficult to figure out how far Spyro is off the ground, but the isometric viewpoint also makes it difficult to estimate where the ground actually is, which can lead to a lot of deaths and a lot of frustration, particularly when you can't even see where it is you're trying to glide to. You're more likely to survive by jumping directly into a volcano. Beyond this, the game is generally very repetitive. It recycles a lot of the same objectives, the structure between each level is often extremely similar, and the game can end up feeling more and more monotonous the longer you play it. Because of this, Spyro Season of Ice ends up being a pretty boring game. Let me reiterate, I don't think this game is bad. I think it's a decent game, and initially I was very impressed with it, and I found it immensely enjoyable. If it was bad, I wouldn't have played it to 100%. But as the game goes on, it doesn't get better or worse, it doesn't get easier or harder, It doesn't get simpler or more complicated, it just continues. It remains the same throughout the whole thing and ends up being very repetitive and occasionally tedious. I would say that Spyro Season of Ice is definitely worth a shot. If you like Spyro, you'll like this game. Hell, I like this game, and for a GBA adaptation of the originals, it's pretty good. But I wouldn't say it's worth going through to see everything. Like I said, once you've finished the first hub world, you've pretty much seen everything the game has to offer. If you keep playing beyond that, it starts to get boring. I reckon if you played it in short bursts rather than marathoning through the whole thing like I did, you're less likely to get bored of it, but still, it can be pretty draining. Which is a shame. With a bit more spice and variation, this game could have been an absolute blast. Something truly special, something that potentially could have rivaled the originals. But it's just decent. It unfortunately falls short of being great in the most boring possible way. But hey, it could have been worse.